Hello, good morning, everyone, or good morning from where I am, and good day to you wherever you are. It's a pleasure to be with you virtually. My presentation on corruption risk and defense governance would focus on the findings from the 2020 Government Defense Integrity Index. And this presentation will be structured in three parts. First, I'll provide an overview of the design and methodology underpinning the GDI. Next, I'll share some of the key global findings from the 2020 iteration of the index. And then finally, I'll provide some selected trends for Asia Pacific compared to the rest of the world and outline some policy recommendations. So to start with, what is the GDI? Well, the GDI measures corruption risk, essentially institutional resilience to corruption in national defense establishments. Assessing these risks are vital simply because corruption in the defense and security sector has a particularly detrimental impact on states' ability to maintain peace and security. Indeed, corruption, as numerous evidence from research has shown, is a root cause of conflict, not just the consequence of it. But I have to emphasize that the GDI does not measure corruption. Rather, it's an evidence-based comprehensive assessment of the quality of institutional controls which are aimed at managing the risk of corruption. And in doing so, it focuses both on policy making and public sector governance in defense establishments. Now, the essential aim of the index is to set good practice standards for governance of the defense sector globally. So what it examines in effect is the existence, the enforcement, and the effectiveness of controls. So if for instance, a legal framework exists, the index looks to assess whether it's enforced, and if it's enforced, we assess whether it's effective. And this is done by assessing legal frameworks and implementation, as well as resources and outcomes. And it's intended to capture the implementation gap between law and practice. We assess 5 risk areas in the index: financial risk, personal risk, political risk, procurement risk, and operational risk. The GDI is undertaking on a 5-year cycle. The last iteration was in 2020, and it covered 86 countries across the world. Let me just provide a brief overview of the key risk areas of the index. As I mentioned, there were 5 key risk areas, but under these 5 risk areas, there are 77 questions, which are further broken down into 212 risk indicators. And each indicator looks at a specific case of corruption risk. So in policy making and political affairs, for instance, we look at whether there's legislative scrutiny of defense policy. And the index assesses each country for measures to look at good practice. And what does good practice look like in defense policy making? For instance, is there a published national defense and security strategy? And is there a strategic approach to anti-corruption? In terms of defense finances, as you can see here, there are several areas that the index will assess. For instance, asset disposals. What is the oversight of secret budgets? And what does good practice look like? Well, good practice in this case will look at whether there are strong controls over asset disposals, whether there's audits, and are they effective? And for instance, no off-budget expenditure, as well as well-justified secret spending. In the area of personnel, the index assesses whether there are clear standards for personnel, regular anti-corruption training taking place, and good practice would capture issues such as strong and robust systems for appointment and promotions, as well as for reporting wrongdoing. In the case of military operations, very critical area, the index assesses issues ranging from whether anti-corruption training for deployed personnel is in place, and also whether corruption risk in the host country is assessed prior to missions. And then in the fifth area of procurement, the index assesses range of issues in terms of contract award and delivery, and whether there's compliance with procurement legislation, and most importantly also to ensure whether there is competition in procurement, and between, for instance, which proportion of the procurement that a nation carries out is subject to single sourcing, and which proportion is subject to open competition. So having provided this overall quick overview of these key risk areas and the area and the sub areas that the index interrogates, let me now turn my attention to provide a bit of a snapshot of the research process that underpins the index. The research for each country is conducted by an expert country assessor, usually a PhD student, a PhD level researcher, a senior journalist and academic who's normally resident in the country being assessed. And the assessor will be using a standard set of questions as well as the GDI scoring rubric. Assessors draw primarily on key official documents, so they would bring in both primary and secondary data, and are expected to conduct both desk research, interviews with key individuals in government, military, academia, civil society, and of course, allowing for confidentiality to protect the safety of informants. The qualitative data must be original. We also expect that each indicator that is examined is supported by at least 2 recent sources. And of course, that is except in the case of de jure indicators, where there is only one piece of, let's say, guiding legislation, or let's say a constitution, that would then stand alone as a single source. And given that scores are awarded on the basis of both quantitative and qualitative data, with a heavy reliance on narrative justifications, it is very important that all the evidence must be properly cited, and then, of course, triangulated for accuracy and objectivity. So the sources used range from policy documents, official speeches, interviews, as I mentioned, with officials and experts. Each assessment is then independently reviewed by 2 individuals separately, expert peer reviewers, who in most cases are senior academics or senior experts who have maybe worked in policy over a period of time on that specific country. And where possible, also, we invite all governments, we write to all governments to also review the assessments. And where there are Transparency International national chapters, we also ask them to review the assessment, submit additional information. Now, in between all these steps, the assessments come back to Transparency International for quality checks and reviews. We send them back to the assessors to provide additional input. And then finally, when it's all completed, all assessments undergo a final validation, comparing every indicator in comparison to other countries in the index, in order to ensure that there's a standardized set of scoring. I may hasten to add here that there was a methodology change between this recent iteration of the index and the one in 2015. while the main 77 questions remain unchanged, the underlying scoring rubric is different. And there were two major changes. First was the introduction of indicators. So in 2015, there were 77 questions which were just scored. But then these 77 questions in 2020 were then broken down into different aspects. And I'll show you an example in a minute. So if we asked whether the legislative scrutiny of defense policy was effective, we would then break it down into whether the legislation exists, and if it exists, if it's enforced, and then if it's enforced, if it's effective. And I'll show you an example in a minute. So it's the breaking down of the questions into different indicators that allows the assessor to drill down in fine detail on a variety of issues across the board of defense sector governance in order to provide a comprehensive reflection of the risk areas. That was the first change. The second was the inclusion of a scoring rubric, which provides a guidance on good practice, on what good practice looks like. So the model answers serve as a good guide, a good practice guidance for defense institutions and assessors. And also it enhances standardized scoring. Now, due to this methodology change, comparisons between the 2015 index and the 2020 index should be limited to individual questions or individual indicators only, if done at all. We advise that is not the comparisons between the two not done, because they would not reflect the same case. Subsequent iterations, let's say the 2025 index, would make it comparable. Now, as a result of the methodology change, in order to reflect the significant methodology changes, the decision was made to change the name of the index from what it was previously known as the Government Defense Anti-Corruption Index to the Government Defense Integrity Index. And the name change, of course, reflects the focus on building institutional controls within the defense sector and as government as a whole. So this is what I was just mentioning just a moment ago, that if this was in 2015, we were just asking this very broad question: is there formal provision for effective and independent legislative scrutiny of defense policy? And it was broken down in 2020 into the formal rights, whether they exist. So does Parliament have formal rights in law to approve or veto laws on security? And that will be scored. Then whether it's effective, whether Parliament regularly approves or vetoes laws. And then finally, if it does so, it's what the independent scrutiny, how whether there is executive or military influence over Parliament. So this basically provides that with a bit more detail. And the scoring rubric for the index has 5 levels, from 0, which basically represents very little institutional resilience or none, to 100, which basically captures very strong and robust institutional resilience to corruption or very low risk of corruption. Now, the scoring rubric, the assessment for every country is aggregated. Basically, first of all the indicators are then aggregated, simple average for each question. Now, all questions are then aggregated into one risk area, again using a simple average, and then all summed up, across the 5 indicators to provide the overall score for a country. Now, the overall scores are then assigned to a band from A to F, which is intended to reflect the level of corruption risk, not corruption, in defense sector institutions. And the bands can be viewed, as you can see on the right-hand side here, in relation to not just the corruption risk, but the institutional resilience to corruption. In addition to providing bands for each country and assigning bands based on the average where a country falls into, we also provide scorecards for each country. Now, the scorecards we publish show scores for each question, and then it provides that a snapshot of the areas of strength and where work is required. So just a quick scan through the different questions and the scoring allows just as a snapshot for one to see where are the areas of strength and which areas also require work, just based on just a quick glance. Right. So having now introduced the GDI and spoken about the research process, let's now turn our attention to what are the key findings from the 2020 index. Well, the GDI global findings, I must say, are a big cause for concern. The global results show that 62% of countries in the index suffer from a high to critical risk of corruption across their defense sectors. Now, this cuts across all regions of the world and all economic groups. If you look at this heat map here, that basically tells a story that all regions of the world have a mix of results. If we look at the country level, you would realize here that again, within the regions, different countries have different scores, but only one country out of the 86 that were assessed in 2020 scores in the top category, and that's New Zealand, which you can see at the very bottom here. If we also take a look on the next page, one would realize that Sub-Saharan Africa and MENA, Middle East and North Africa, tend to have a bit of more pronounced risk and underlying issues which review weak institutional resilience to corruption. And most of these countries range, as you can see, most of them fall into the category of very high risk to critical risk. Now, looking at the individual five risk areas, what are some of the key highlights that we realize here? So in defense policy making and political affairs, one of the key issues that the analysis of the GDI data revealed was that democratic oversight of the defense sector is under threat in a wide range of countries. In 41% of countries with strong formal rights, parliaments consistently failed to take advantage of their oversight powers or simply did not debate or review defense policy at all. Now, a variety of factors emerge as possible explanations for this. Populist-driven executive overreach or lack of expertise and staffing to support parliamentarians, or compromised information flows between ministries and the legislature. 84% of countries, which is a very good score, have anti-corruption policy in place, but only 54% of these countries have, or 50% of these countries have no implementation record. So that's concerning. Quickly turning to defense finances. In general, governments may publish three broad categories of budget documents. The initial budget adopted prior to the start of the fiscal year, a revised budget released during the fiscal year that shows changes in priorities, and an actual expenditure document at the end of the year. Now, 52% of countries we assessed published disaggregated data on actual expenditure. 48% did not, review the difference between the budget and, the actual expenditure that occurred. So we see that governments are frequently failing to report on actual defense spending. Another trend that emerged was that there was limited scrutiny of spending on secret items. About 40% of countries in the index did not provide the relevant legislative committee with information on secret items, which basically is a concern. In terms of personnel management, well, some good news there. That was the highest scoring area in the index, with overall globally scoring 53 over 100, so it's moderate risk of corruption. But then there are still significant challenges in this area because codes of conduct for military personnel in 40% of countries either did not address corruption issues or did not exist at all. For some positive news from personnel management to not so welcome news in terms of military operations. Military operations stands out as the most compromised risk area. Globally, the average score was just 16 over 100, so that falls into the critical risk of corruption category. So this just essentially means that on the front line, there is significant potential for corruption to undermine military operations around the world, and be they aimed at securing peace internally or abroad. Now, if we delve a bit more into military operations and what the scores tell us is that we basically found out that for most countries, one thing that was missing was the inclusion of anti-corruption issues in their overarching military doctrine, which the overarching military doctrine can be a crucial element in laying the foundations for the development of strong corruption controls as part of military operations. Because the doctrine helps to establish the common standard operating procedures and for fulfilling objectives. But then few countries have included references to corruption in these doctrines. In fact, 70% of the 86 countries we assessed scored a 0 on this particular question of whether anti-corruption was included in the overarching military doctrine. So one can basically draw some analysis from this that for these countries, corruption is not officially considered as a strategic issue, or there are no firm guidelines on how to mitigate the associated risk when it comes to operations and corruption issues. In fact, out of these countries that scored a 0 for anti-corruption or may be mentioned in the overarching military doctrine, 14 of the 22 NATO countries that we assessed fell into this bracket. This disregard of corruption trickles down then to training and education, which we think are essential. Pre-deployment anti-corruption training for commanders is essential. And then we would now quickly turn our attention to procurement. And I'll come back again to military operations in a bit because that's very, very important. So finally, in terms of procurement, procurement continues to be one of the most secretive and least accountable spheres of activity in the defense sector. In fact, the analysis of the GDI data showed us that nearly 30% of the countries in the index make no information available on the share of defense procurement that is conducted through open competition. Now, in terms of arms exports, for instance, 86% of global arms exports originated from countries moderate with moderate to very high risk of corruption and are ending up in countries basically with very high or high to critical risk of corruption. So 49% of arms are going into countries with high to critical corruption risk, which is a cause for concern. If we again delve a bit more into the procurement issue here, would also, from the analysis that we did with the data, we take a closer look and we realize that 40% of the countries in GDI score a 0 for acquisition planning. And this includes 5 of the top 10 arms importers. So what does this mean? This means that these countries either have no clear process in place for acquisition planning, or the process exists, but they are not clear and contain few connections between purchases and strategic requirements. Again, a cause for concern. So out of these top 10, most basically are scoring in the critical risk category, with only 3 in the low risk category, and that's an issue. So let's turn our attention to some of the key trends we see. We assessed 15 countries in Asia Pacific. Now, the overall score for Asia Pacific points to the fact that, so the averaging the 15 countries, the overall score falls into the high risk of corruption category. But of course, there are huge variations in the quality of defense governance mechanisms, which determine how well defense institutions can respond to these. So, because if we take a look at that region, Asia Pacific, for instance, the region is home to both the highest scorer in the index, which is New Zealand, and Myanmar, which is one of the lowest. But then if we take one country, let's take Taiwan. Taiwan, for instance, also overperforms when compared to the regional scores and the global scores across the board in all the 5 key risk areas. But then one realizes that even though Taiwan scores quite well in political and financial and with personnel, that's very well in line with the trend across the index. Military operations still is an area where there is cause for concern with a high corruption risk category. So let's focus on operations, which has emerged as a key issue. Let's go back again to Asia Pacific. And looking at Asia Pacific, the overall score for the region was 24 over 100, very high corruption risk. But then it compares, to the overall average for the 22 NATO countries that we assessed. Again, G7, same score as G7. And this goes to underscore the point that operations is an issue across the board for all countries and requires serious attention. Again, looking at military operations, I think it's essential that, again, we take a look at why we keep saying this is a critical issue on the front line. We look at 8 of the top 15 troop contribution countries to United Nations peacekeeping. And out of these 8 that we assessed, most fall into the critical risk of corruption category, which is again a key source for concern. So what does this all mean? What are we trying to actually point to here in military operations? Well, I'm just taking a sample of the one of 2 questions here. We are following the good practice standards and trying to assess whether there's comprehensive training on corruption issues for commanders at all levels, and whether this training is also delivered, one, as part of military education, and also prior to deployment for specific missions. Again, is corruption considered a strategic issue in forward planning? That is critical. So the good practice standards that we are trying to assess when it comes to military operations essentially requires corruption issues to be at the front and the center of both forward planning and training prior to deployment. So based on the key findings that we've actually shared with you today, the key recommendations globally, based on the trends that we've shared, is that business as usual would not work. We need to elevate the discussion of defense governance and corruption risk in the political discourse. When we look at the political risk and defense policy making category, one of the key recommendations is for strengthening the capacity and the incentives for parliamentary oversight, so that the legislator in respective countries have the independence to enable effective scrutiny. In terms of defense finances, what it points to is that I think we need to enhance transparency of actual defense spending. And of course, there will be exceptions made for secret spending, but the appropriate committees should be given full access to it. In terms of personnel management, strengthening systems for dealing with wrongdoing, so whistleblowing mechanisms, and also ensuring that cases investigated and prosecuted through formal processes without undue influence would be vital. With military operations, anti-corruption needs to be integrated into military operations, with missions properly assessing and planning for corruption risk as part of troop training and during deployment. And for procurement also, one of the broad recommendations that we make is for the complete overhaul of procurement systems to provide for more open competition and transparency, and that there is clear delineation between what a country needs. So the procurement systems should be aligned to the national security strategy, and basically these should also be quite transparent, so that there is a clear match to what a country is buying and to what its strategic requirements are. Basically, with this, there should be very little exceptions made in terms of good practice, so that one can assess a logical flow down from the strategy to individual procurements without any exception. So I'd say that the GDI reveals significant weaknesses in governance of the defense sector globally. And even though defense and security is often cited as exceptional and outside the remit of standard governance reforms, I would argue that the principles of good governance still apply in the current global context, which is marked by shrinking civic space. I think now it is more important than ever to ensure that civil society have the space and the freedom and the voice to basically make known their concern and bring the expertise to the table, and creating space for all stakeholders, whether it be minorities or women's organizations, to engage in that oversight and processes remains crucial for effective scrutiny of defense governance. So overall, the evidence of the GDI underscores the pressing need for action to be taken to address the challenges in defense governance that I've shared with you globally. And I'll just end by saying that corruption in defense is a real and present danger. There are wealth of resources that we have available, and as you can see on my screen here, we basically share the full data set of every country assessment that contains the explanations, the sources that underpin those explanations, the scores are all available for download on our website. And the other key document that I shared with you was the country briefs for each country. Those are also there. And then there's a fantastic GDI Global Report that offers in-depth analysis across all the regions and the sectors, and also does cross-analysis with other indices. That's also available on the website. So I'll just end by saying thank you very much for your kind attention this morning.